My name is Ruby, and my life has been intertwined with my sister Natalie for as long as I can remember. Natalie has been battling illness since childhood, and despite our family's financial means to afford a full-time caregiver, it was always me who took care of her. You might wonder why Natalie couldn't survive without my constant presence. Well, she suffers from chronic kidney disease and severe anemia, both of which necessitate regular blood transfusions. And the only compatible blood source for her is me. Frankly, I'm surprised I have any blood left, considering how many times I've donated to her. There were moments when I fainted, but not once did I complain. Natalie is not just my sister, she's my best friend, and I'd go to any lengths to ensure her well-being. However, our unique situation did have its quirks. To be honest, she was my only friend, and I had no idea what it was like to have friends outside of our relationship. People often found our closeness strange. I remember the first time I took her to a support meeting. I held her hand throughout the meeting, and when she stood up to introduce herself, I instinctively stood up with her. I overheard someone whispering that we looked like a couple, and soon laughter echoed around us. After the meeting, we went to the bathroom together, and those same people were watching us closely. "She's my sister!" "All right," I yelled defiantly. But when I looked at Natalie, I saw tears in her eyes. My sister was incredibly sensitive. That night, I held her close and made her a promise that I would never abandon her, no matter what challenges we faced. The following week, during one of our meetings, I briefly left Natalie to use the restroom. On my way back, I was met with a shock that sent my heart racing. Natalie was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in as I began shouting her name frantically, drawing bewildered looks from everyone around me. But then, to my immense relief, I spotted her lying on the floor in the adjacent room. My heart pounded with fear. "Was she okay, Julian?" The man overseeing the meeting was already with her. He tried to reassure me, explaining that she was fine but had called for an ambulance, which was on its way. Together, we rushed her to the hospital, and Julian didn't leave our side. Despite my initial reservations, I found him to be genuinely caring and sweet. Inside the hospital room, the doctors informed me that Natalie's blood pressure had dropped, but that she could be released in a few hours. While we waited, Julian kindly invited me to grab a cup of coffee. During our conversation, he asked me about the peculiar dynamics of my relationship with my sister. Overwhelmed, I chose to remain silent. Lowering my head as tears welled up in my eyes, Julian didn't push the matter. Instead, he gently lifted my chin, wiped away my tears, and assured me it was all right if I didn't want to discuss it. He embraced me warmly, which managed to lift my spirits, and soon we were chatting about various unrelated topics. Unexpectedly, he began flirting with me, and I found myself reciprocating the interest. It felt like he was about to lean in for a kiss when an abrupt voice shattered the moment. "What do you think you're doing, young lady?" It was my mother, surprisingly showing concern for her sick daughter's well-being. I quickly made my exit to spare myself the embarrassment, promising Julian I'd catch up with him later. My mother appeared more distressed by my interaction with a boy than the fact that her other daughter was hospitalized, but I had grown accustomed to her reactions. For some inexplicable reason, my parents had always been strict about dating, making it clear that it wasn't something I could pursue. Despite their rules, thoughts of Julian consumed me all week long. Eventually, my longing became unbearable, and I decided to take matters into my own hands. I scoured the internet, meticulously tracking down Julian's contact information on the chronic kidney disease support website, and sent him a text. I had to be cautious, texting him when my sister was asleep to avoid her curiosity. I would stealthily hide my phone under my pillow, eagerly awaiting his response. The thrill of hearing my phone buzz was palpable. Our texting conversations began in earnest, and he eventually asked if we could go on a real date. My heart leaped at the idea, but I couldn't leave my sister alone. That's when Julian came up with a plan. During our next support group meeting, a guest speaker was scheduled. Julian approached me and asked if I could assist him in preparing some tea and cookies for everyone. My sister assured me she would be fine on her own, and so I found myself alone in a kitchen with Julian. Without wasting a moment, he leaned in and kissed me, and it felt like a dream. As we talked, I felt a newfound sense of openness with him. I confided in him about my circumstances, the values my parents instilled in me regarding the unwavering commitment between sisters, and how that was the only way I knew how to live. Julian gazed at me intently and posed a question that shook me to my core. "But what about you? When do you ever do anything for yourself?" His inquiry left me speechless. I had never contemplated my own desires or needs because, in my mind, focusing on myself felt selfish. However, the next day brought devastating news that would turn my world upside down. My sister was rushed to the hospital, and the doctors delivered the crushing verdict that her kidneys were unresponsive to treatment. One of my sister's kidneys had completely failed, and her life hung in the balance unless she received a donor kidney soon. I sat there in the hospital room, tightly gripping her hand, tears streaming down my face. Our parents, on the other hand, wore serene smiles and casually remarked, "No worries, we already have a donor. Ruby will happily donate one of her kidneys to her sister, won't you, dear?" They continued to discuss the logistics and the timeline for the procedure. I was dumbfounded. They hadn't even bothered to consult me. It felt as though they could have signed me up for a full organ donation without a second thought. "Sure, doc, take my kidneys. Take my liver. What else do you need?" That's how it seemed. My mother didn't even glance my way. She simply inquired about the paperwork and scheduling. However, the doctors interrupted her and turned their attention to me, asking Ruby, "Is this okay with you? Are you comfortable with this?" My mother interjected, asserting, "Yes, of course she is." That's when I couldn't take it any longer. It was the first time in my life that I found the strength to stand up and shout, "No, I don't agree. I don't agree at all. You never asked me what I want." I stormed out of that room, my heart pounding, my eyes brimming with tears. My mother yelled after me, calling me a selfish brat, but I paid her no mind. It marked the first time I had truly distanced myself from my sister. I briefly contemplated returning to her side, but I needed some space. I needed to see Julian. I called him and arranged to meet. I didn't even glance back to see if my parents were following me. We met at a cafe, and I poured my heart out to Julian. On one hand, I wanted to save my sister's life, but on the other hand, what about my own life? It felt like I had spent my entire existence taking care of her. Julian expressed his astonishment at this unprecedented situation and criticized my parents for their treatment of me. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He began probing into my childhood, asking about how my parents had treated me. I explained that they were like any other strict parents, seemingly more focused on rules and less on my individual needs and desires. I began sharing with Julian that my parents didn't even have photos of me, only those of my sister. He found this unusual and, given his experience in his field, expressed his concern about my family's behavior. He told me that he had never encountered such an unusual family dynamic before, and suggested that he could look into my sister's records to uncover what was going on. I asked if I could accompany him because I didn't want to return home. What came next left me in utter disbelief. Julian retrieved my sister's records and then dropped a bombshell. "Ruby, your sister's file doesn't show any indication that she has any other siblings. It's as if you don't exist in her records. You're sure you're related, right?" I assured him that we were indeed siblings, but when he examined my own records, the look on his face made it clear that something was seriously amiss. Julian hesitated and then told me the shocking truth. "Ruby, it appears that you're not her biological sister. You were adopted." I couldn't comprehend it. There had to be a mistake. All I had ever known was my family, and I had no recollection of any other parents or homes. My world seemed to crumble around me. He showed me my file, and it confirmed that I had been adopted 17 years ago when I was just 1 year old. I felt an overwhelming sense of nausea. How could my parents have concealed this truth from me all these years? Julian drove me back home, and as I approached the driveway, my mother came rushing out, frantically asking where I had been and stating that my sister needed me. I waved my file in her face and demanded answers. She appeared on the verge of fainting, and that's when the truth emerged. It turned out that after giving birth to my sister and realizing her health condition, my parents had concluded that it was too risky to have more biological children. Their genetics posed a heightened risk of chronic disease for their offspring. To ensure that my sister wouldn't be alone in the world, they decided to adopt a baby, a decision they had kept hidden from me all these years. Due to their immense wealth and significant donations to the orphanage, my parents had the privilege of choosing the baby they wanted to adopt. Their sole condition was that the baby had to be blood type O. And there it was, the undeniable truth. I had been adopted solely to save the life of their cherished daughter. They had exploited me for years, and they didn't care if I suffered from donating a kidney, as long as their biological daughter survived. I couldn't bear to stay a moment longer. Filled with rage, I fled the house, leaving my sister behind, sobbing on the sofa. Julian offered me shelter and suggested that we report my parents. My anger burned hot, but my thoughts kept drifting back to my sister. What if she didn't make it? Was I truly the only potential donor? The taste of newfound freedom was enticing, but the prospect of a life without her was unbearable. I knew what I had to do. However, the following week, I received a text from my mother. "Your sister is in critical condition. She won't accept your kidney. You are the most selfish person I've ever known." Unable to bear the thought of her death, I contacted the hospital and proposed that they present me as an anonymous donor, hoping she would accept it that way. The surgery was scheduled for the upcoming week, but then the unimaginable occurred. The hospital called, stating that my sister's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and they required the donation as soon as possible. I rushed to the hospital, finding my sister already unconscious in the operating room. The medical team swiftly prepared me for the surgery, and after a few grueling hours, it was finally completed. Exhausted, I requested a separate room from the doctor because I didn't want her to know that I was the donor. The operation had drained every ounce of my energy. I couldn't even tell how long I had slept before I opened my eyes and saw my sister sitting in a chair by my bedside. She looked at me and said, "It was you, wasn't it? They said it was an anonymous donor, but I know you too well, sis." Tears welled up in my eyes immediately. I had never felt such overwhelming joy at seeing my sister. The transplant had been a success, and I had no regrets about my decision. Julian and I assured my sister that she could come stay with us whenever she wanted. The best part was that I could finally pursue my college dreams, knowing that I had saved my sister's life. And, of course, I wouldn't have to face those heartless people who would raise me ever again.